Hey guys, Frosty Knives here, back with another book review, and today we are on book 3 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. We are on Memories of Ice. Now, it has been brought to my attention in a previous video that while I'm not giving away spoilers about the story, I'm actually not giving away anything about the story, and it was suggested that maybe I just read the back of the book so that people who are not familiar with this series have at least something to make a judgment on about whether or not this seems like a book they would be interested in. And I thought that was a fair comment, so I'm going to do that. And since we're only on book 3, I'm going to read the backs of the first 3 books just to catch you guys up to speed so that you'll know whether or not this is a series that may pique your interest. So, Gardens of the Moon, which we've already reviewed, back of the book reads as: The Malazan Empire simmers with discontent, bled dry with interminable warfare, bitter infighting, and bloody confrontations. Even the imperial legions, long inured to the bloodshed, yearn for some respite. Yet Empress Lacine's rule remains absolute, enforced by her dread claw assassins. For Sergeant Whiskey Jack and his squad of bridge burners, and for Tattersail, surviving cadre mage of the 2nd Legion, the aftermath of the siege of Payol should have been a time to mourn the many dead. But Darujistan, last of the free cities of Genabacchus, yet holds out. It is to this ancient citadel that Lacine turns her predatory gaze. However, it would appear that the Empire is not alone in this great game. Sinister, shadow-bound forces are gathering as the gods themselves prepare to play their hand. It's pretty intriguing. And then we move on to Book 2, Deadhouse Gates. In the vast dominion of 7 cities, in the holy desert Raraku, the seer Shaik and her followers prepare for the long prophesied uprising known as the Whirlwind. They want to rebel against the Malazan Empire. Unprecedented in size and savagery, this maelstrom of fanaticism and bloodlust will embroil the Malazan Empire in one of the bloodiest conflicts it has ever known, shaping destinies and giving birth to legends. Holy hell, that's an understatement. Set in a brilliantly realized world ravaged by dark, uncontrollable magic, this thrilling novel of war, intrigue, and betrayal confirms Stephen Erikson as a storyteller of breathtaking skill. And I got a little bit into the playing it up for the crowd thing. That leads us to Memories of Ice, Book 3. Here we go. The ravaged continent of Genabacchus has given birth to a terrifying new empire, the Panian Domain. Like a tide of corrupted blood, it seethes across the land, devouring all. In its path stands an uneasy alliance, One Arm's army and Whiskey Jack's bridge burners alongside their enemies of old, the forces of the warlord Caladan Brood, Animander Rake and his Taistan D mages, and the Rivi people of the plains. But ancient undead clans are also gathering. The Tulan Imas have risen. For it would seem something altogether darker and more malign threatens this world. Rumors abound that the crippled god is now unchained and intent on a terrible revenge. So now you are up to speed on where we are in the Malazan Empire books, and if any of that intrigues you, and that seems to be your cup of tea, these might be some good books to pick up. Now, let's give a little bit of particulars on this one here. Book number 3. This book was published in 2001, and it clocks in at, hold on, 900 And you really should be more prepared for some of this. 913 pages, minus the glossary, the appendices, the maps, and etc., and forthwith and adding on and all of that stuff. So now we are on book 3, and the books just keep getting bigger, and the story just keeps getting bigger, and the scope just keeps getting wider. And that's the one thing I can say about this book. If I were to describe this book in one word, it would be scope. And what I mean by that is, in the first book, really focused, right, on the Battle of Pale and Darujistan. Really focused, lasered in onto what's going on in that particular city and what the Malazan Empire is doing. So we get a really tight, focused look at 2 singular events that are happening on the continent. Book 2, we go to a different continent, and the scope pulls back. So now we start to see what's going on in another continent and some rebellions and how the Empire is dealing with what's going on in Deadhouse Gates. And we get to see more people and their journeys through this world. We get to see more conflicts, more bloodshed, more wars, more battles. We get to see the Chain of Dogs. We get to see all that. So the scope sort of pulls back a little bit further. Then we get to book 3, and the scope really begins to pull back. It pulls back so much so that you begin to see the history of the world. Stephen Erikson begins to tell us the history of what's going on, the history of the continent, the history of certain things. And by history, I mean, and I don't think this is a spoiler, although it might be, by history, I mean, he goes back 300,000 years at the beginning of this book to tell us about an event that happens 300,000 years ago and then 200,000 years ago, and brings us back forward to how that relates to what is going on in this book. So we really start to see history. We really start to see longevity. We really start to see the scope of what's going on, the players, what's going on, where they sort of started, some of them, and how they're all starting to converge as we get further and further along in the world. I will say I did really enjoy this book. A lot of people have said that Memories of Ice was phenomenal, that it was the best book in the series so far. There's lots of praise about this book. I did enjoy it. I did give it a 5 on Goodreads. I will say, though, as a little bit of a caveat, I enjoyed Deadhouse Gates more. Not that this is bad, not that that is better, but out of the 3, I think so far my favorite is Deadhouse Gates, based on what we were shown in that book. This book is dense. This book is very, very dense. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of players going on, a lot of things happening, a lot of backstory, a lot of characters, lots of things converging, lots of places and wars and battles. I found this one to be more dense than the first 2, if that can be, if I can say that. This is more dense than the other 2, and I think it's because the scope is so wide. There's so much going on. There's so much information that he's giving you. So many people, so many moves and counter moves, so many people working in the shadows, so many powers that are trying to move and juxtaposition and power. A lot of wonderful, great characters going on in this book. The body count is high, just like we're used to in these books. These books are brutal. There's a lot going on. There is a very high death count. And this is where he starts to really start pounding on your heartstrings, where he really starts to crushing the hope out of you, if it were, because this book is brutal. Deadhouse Gates was brutal on a grand scope. I think this was brutal in a personal scope, along the lines of Martin. Where we're just now we're getting into the groove. We're starting to get connected to characters. We're starting to root for certain people, certain things that are going on, and then all of a sudden here comes Erikson with the damn hammer, and boom! And this book I found to be a lot more brutal, a lot more depressing than Chain of Dogs, a lot more grief in this book. A lot more things that have happened. That there were more times in this book where I would read it and something would happen and I just have to put it down and walk away, and I just have to let it sit. So this, I think, is where we're starting to get the brutality of things. We're really starting to see the scope, and I think you're really starting to see that there are things going on that you thought you knew what was going on, but then it's revealed that there are things going on. There are players in the game that you didn't know about starting to play, to move, to make moves, and the what's on the line is so much more than you thought it was, right? Like, what is on the line? What is at stake? The stakes are so much higher than you thought they were, because in the beginning, you thought it was an empire trying to subdue the continents to bring these cities under its rule, and then you see the rebellion going on in the second book as they're rebelling against this empire. And then you get to this book and you realize that there's so many more strings being played, so many more players coming forward. And I think that really touches on a theme that's running through all of these books so far, and that is the theme of control. Control and fate, and who is in control. Everybody thinks that they're in control of their own destiny, and everybody thinks that what they're doing is correct, and everybody thinks that what they're doing is of their own volition, that they are making these decisions, and you're starting to realize that that's not the case. And the people in the books are starting to realize that that's not the case, that they thought they were in control, but they're starting to realize that they're just pawns of a bigger game. So who's really pulling the strings? Who's really making the moves and the decisions? And when you are talking about involving ascendants and people, mortals who have become gods, and when you're talking about gods themselves, elder gods, this pantheon of just god beings, and then you start talking about near immortal races that have lived for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, that have just seen so much death and brutality, that you begin to realize, who's in charge? Who's pulling the strings? You think you are, but are you really? And as people in these books begin to realize that maybe they're not in charge, that maybe they're all just pawns, that maybe this is all just some big game of the gods, that changes the scope of the story. That changes the outlook. That changes the motivation. So that's where we are in Memories of Vice. The characters are wonderful. Again, we're being introduced to so many new characters, so many different players, so many different people, so many different backstories. Characters are wonderful. The story was brutal. The wars were brutal. The Panion Domain was just that whole storyline. What they were doing to, it was graphic. It was brutal. It was some terrible, terrible things going on. The dialogue is not bad. The more I read of Erikson, the more I realize that his dialogue, he likes to be a little bit flowery with how people are talking to each other. I noticed as the books go on that he likes to use names, first names. He likes to, when two characters talk to each other, they use each other's names a lot, and that's very weird to me, because when I'm talking to people, I don't use their name in every sentence, right? I don't say to them. I don't use their full name like I'm talking to them like, hello, Tony Smith, how are you doing today? Well, Frosty Knives, I'm doing well. How are you doing? I am doing wonderful, Tony Smith. How are you doing? There's a lot of that going on where the characters are using each other's names a lot. It helps so you don't forget who's who, but it's a little weird to have that kind of structure. There's a lot of people who pontificate in this book, a lot of philosophizing going on in this book, and I think that's also a theme of the books, is that the characters philosophize a lot, and they like to talk about things and like to spin it out into this big flowery philosophy, and that happens a lot in Memories of Ice. So just be aware that this is how he writes dialogue. It's not necessarily bad. Sometimes it can grind things to a halt because you're philosophizing something that you already sort of understand. You know what's going on, but the characters spend like 10 minutes talking about the philosophy of what's going on, as opposed to maybe a shorter, truncated version of that, so that it allows the reader to make their own philosophical decisions. So that's going on in the book. But the characters are great. The story is brutal. The battles are brutal. We're really starting to get into the scope of things now. We're really starting to realize what's at stake. And the first 3 books just barrel along. They just barrel along like a cannonball shot out of a cannon, and we're just along for the ride. And so I did give Memories of Ice a 5 on Goodreads. I think it deserves a 5. I do. I think both Deadhouse Gates and Memories of Ice were wonderful books, were great books with a lot of good pieces. Both deserves to be 5-star ratings. I just enjoyed Deadhouse Gates more. I just enjoyed the story that was going on in Deadhouse Gates a little more. But that's not to say that Memories of Ice is not a phenomenal book, because it is. And now it answers some questions. It ties some knots up really nicely. Some of the questions, it's starting to answer some of the breadcrumbs and the questions that it's posed in the first 2 books. But like any good book in a series of this length, it's leaving us with more questions that it's hopefully going to answer down the line. So he is beginning to tie the points together. He is beginning to converge the storylines together, the people, what's going on. Some answers are given, more questions are asked. So hopefully those will be answered further down the road. So guys, that was my review of Memories of Ice as we continue on this fantastically convoluted, fantastical world story building epic adventure. I don't know how many more buzzwords to put into this. And I can't imagine anybody ever trying to turn any of this into a movie. And it's interesting because I read an interview with Steven Erikson at one point where they talked about making these books movies, and he said that he doesn't think this will ever get made into a movie, because the way he envisions it is he envisions each book, if they were going to make these books into a movie, he envisions each book to be a trilogy. So 3 movies per book. That's 30 movies to completely cover the story that he's telling in movie form, and that's what he would envision. So I highly doubt we'll ever get anything like this in movie form, and that's probably good, because some things are better left to the imagination. Some things are better left up here. So guys, that is my review of Memories of Ice. I hope you enjoyed it. Like, comment, subscribe, pass it along, pass it around, show it to your friends, show it to your enemies, tell it to everybody, tell it to the little birds that are sitting out there in front of the window that just want a little bit of birdseed. And until next time, as I am now about halfway through House of Chains, which will be the next stop on the Malazan journey, So until next time, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.